By the winter of 1883, in the village of Waddesdon, near Aylesbury, Buckinghamshire, the great state dining room of Waddesdon Manor was finally laid for 42. Outside, the hill that was once bare farmland is dark and wind-stripped. Inside, light fractures in 100 points along gilded mirrors and cut crystal. The neo-Renaissance château, designed by the Parisian architect Hippolyte Destailleur for Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, has taken nearly a decade to rise from the leveled summit of Lodge Hill. On the long table, a Meissen dinner service runs like porcelain rail track from end to end, flanked by silver commissioned for kings and rose-filled vases copied from an 1890s photograph. Beauvais tapestries watch from the walls, marble, gilding, and candlelight fold into one shimmering surface. It is a room built for appetite and influence, for prime ministers and princes, for bond issuers and policy-makers. Yet even tonight, beneath the chandeliers, the polished table reflects a quieter truth. The power assembled here will pass, but the empty chairs will remain. In the spring of 1874, Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild stood on Lodge Hill and looked across an estate he did not yet own in any meaningful sense. The land belonged, on paper, to the Duke of Marlborough, who was selling off agricultural parcels to meet debts that even Blenheim Palace could not conceal. What Ferdinand saw was not the Buckinghamshire countryside as it appeared to tenant farmers or fox-hunting gentry, but as a site, bare, elevated, and waiting. There were no ornamental gardens, no drive suitable for carriages, no house at all. Only stripped woodland, chalk soil, and the cold pragmatism of English agriculture stretched across the view. He was 33 years old, a widower, and already wealthy beyond the calculus of most Victorian gentlemen. His wife, Evelina, daughter of his uncle Lionel de Rothschild, had died in childbirth only 18 months into their marriage, and the loss had left Ferdinand both alone and restless. He did not need another London house. The family already commanded mansions at Piccadilly and Gunnersbury. What he wanted was something less easily bought, a country seat that would announce without apology that a Jewish banker could inhabit the landscape of English power as naturally as any duke. The purchase was completed in 1874, but the transformation took longer. Over the next 3 years, Ferdinand's agents and engineers began the work of turning Lodge Hill into a building site. The summit was carved flat, removing topsoil and reshaping the contours to create a broad plateau large enough to support a château. Access roads were cut through the estate, and the surrounding woodlands, once part of a hunting preserve, were cleared or replanted according to designs that had not yet been drawn. In photographs taken during these early years, the hill looks wounded. Raw earth, exposed chalk, the geometry of human intention carved into what had been, until recently, farmland. Ferdinand did not hire an English architect. Instead, he turned to Gabriel Hippolyte Destailleur, a Parisian designer known for his meticulous revivals of 18th-century French interiors. Destailleur had built his reputation restoring hôtels particuliers in the Faubourg Saint-Germain and designing new châteaux for industrialists who wanted the appearance of old nobility. His aesthetic was not inventive, it was archaeological. He studied the proportions of Versailles, the decorative grammar of the Trianon, and the spatial hierarchies of Loire Valley Château, then reassembled them with the precision of a scholar rebuilding a classical urn from fragments. For Waddesdon, Destailleur proposed a neo-Renaissance design that looked deliberately, almost provocatively, French. The roofline would echo the steep slate towers of Chambord and Blois. The façade would carry the delicate stonework and sculpted details of the late French Renaissance, particularly the style associated with François I. Inside, the enfilade of state rooms, drawing room, smoking room, and dining room would follow the spatial logic of a royal palace, each room opening into the next along a central axis, each interior finished with 18th-century French paneling, tapestries, and furniture that Ferdinand was already acquiring from Parisian dealers and aristocratic estates. The choice was neither accidental nor purely aesthetic. In 1870s, Britain, a Jewish family, no matter how wealthy, remained outside the traditional structures of landed power. The Rothschilds could underwrite government loans, finance railways, and broker international treaties, but they could not inherit peerages, and their social acceptance depended on wealth deployed with both generosity and tact. By building a French château in Buckinghamshire, Ferdinand was choosing a visual language that bypassed English country house convention entirely. He was not imitating the Gothic revival romanticism of Pugin or the Italianate villas favored by newer industrialists. He was reaching across the Channel to the court culture of pre-revolutionary France, a world where Jewish financiers had also moved in aristocratic circles and where taste, rather than bloodline, determined one's place at the table. On Destailleur's early drawings and elevations, dated between 1874 and 1877, the state dining room is already clearly marked. It occupies a prominent position on the first floor, part of the enfilade that would lead visitors from the Oval Hall through a sequence of increasingly formal spaces. The room is conceived as a long, axial chamber, its proportions calibrated to frame a dining table as carefully as a gallery frames a painting. Even before the foundation stone was laid in August 1877, the room in which ministers would one day dine already existed on paper, a geometry of mirrors, marble, and controlled light. In the architect's mind, the dining room was not merely a place to eat. It was a theater of power, a space designed to demonstrate that hospitality, when exercised at this scale and with this level of aesthetic refinement, was itself a form of influence. The walls would carry Beauvais tapestries, the ceiling would be coffered and gilded, the central chandelier would hang directly above the middle of the table, its crystals catching light from gas jets that could, by the 1880s, be switched to electric bulbs at the touch of a button. Every surface, every material, every sightline was calculated to serve a single function, to make the guest feel both welcomed and observed, both honored and measured. Ferdinand understood this instinctively. He had grown up in a family where architecture was never neutral. His grandfather, Nathan Mayer Rothschild, had operated from a modest office in the city of London, but his uncles had built palaces, Ferrières in France, Mentmore in England, that redefined what a private residence could be. Ferdinand's own fortune came from the same sources: banking, railways, mining concessions brokered across Europe and the Near East. But wealth alone did not grant access to the inner circles of British political life. What mattered was how that wealth was housed, displayed, and, most importantly, shared. In the plans, the diners are still blank silhouettes, but the room already assumes their importance. Between 1877 and 1883, while Waddesdon's foundations were being laid and its walls rising stone by stone, another construction was unfolding in parallel: the assembly of the interior. Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild did not wait for the house to be finished before commissioning its contents. Instead, he moved through the auction houses, private dealers, and aristocratic estates of Paris and London with the focused energy of a collector who understood that objects, particularly old objects, carried a kind of inherited legitimacy that new money could never quite purchase on its own. The dining room was conceived from the beginning as a Versailles-inflected space. Destailleur's plans called for marble dados running the length of the walls, gilded mirrors positioned to multiply candlelight, and Beauvais tapestries chosen not for their subject matter alone, but for their courtly provenance. Ferdinand acquired two large panels, the Fountain of Love and the Flute Player, both woven in the 18th century and later recorded in estate inventories as hanging on either side of the ornate overmantel. The tapestries depicted pastoral scenes in the manner of François Boucher, shepherds and nymphs arranged in compositions that suggested leisure, refinement, and a world where labor was invisible and pleasure was the only work that mattered. The furniture came from multiple centuries and sources, stitched together by Ferdinand's taste and his agent's diligence. 18th century French seat furniture, gilt chairs upholstered in silk damask, was purchased from estates whose owners could no longer afford to maintain them. Console tables, side cabinets, and a pair of carved torchères were acquired through Parisian dealers who specialized in supplying nouveau riche industrialists and bankers with the material remnants of the Ancien Régime. Ferdinand was not alone in this appetite. Across Europe and America, the children of railroad magnates and financiers were furnishing new houses with old paneling, old tapestries, and old silver, as if age itself could be bought and installed along with the plumbing. But Waddesdon's dining table was set with something more recent and more pointed, a silver service originally commissioned for King George III. The service, ornate, heavily wrought, bearing royal arms and maker's marks from the 1760s, had passed through several hands before Ferdinand acquired it in the early 1880s. Its presence on the table was both historical citation and quiet assertion. The dining room of a Jewish banker would use the same silver that had once graced the table of a king. Records do not explain whether Ferdinand saw irony in this arrangement or simply appropriateness. The porcelain was equally deliberate. Ferdinand assembled services from Sèvres and Meissen, both royal manufactories whose products had long been reserved for courts and aristocratic households. The Meissen service, in particular, became iconic in later photographs, each piece painted with delicate floral motifs, the rims edged in gilt, the whole ensemble arranged along the length of the table like a parade of small, breakable monuments. When the house finally opened to visitors in 1959, curators would reconstruct the table settings by studying Ferdinand's own photographs, placing silk flowers where fresh roses had once stood, trying to freeze a dinner that had ended decades earlier. The room's lighting was as carefully planned as its furnishings. Destailleur designed the space around a central axis, with the dining table positioned directly beneath a massive crystal chandelier. The chandelier itself, acquired from a French source and electrified in the 1880s, became a kind of technological marvel. When Queen Victoria visited Waddesdon in 1890, she asked to see the electric lights turned on and off, fascinated by the way illumination could now be summoned with a switch rather than a match. The installation of electric lighting in a house this remote, this newly built, required its own small power station on the estate grounds, another invisible infrastructure supporting the visible performance of effortless hospitality. But the room was more than an assembly of expensive objects. Destailleur's design integrated architecture and decoration into a single orchestrated effect. The marble dados, cool, pale stone imported from French quarries, ran along the base of the walls, providing a visual foundation that grounded the room's verticality. Above the dados, the walls were divided into panels, some filled with tapestries, others with mirrors that reflected candlelight and the faces of diners back into the room, multiplying the sense of presence and occasion. The ceiling was coffered and gilded, each recessed panel ornamented with carved rosettes that caught light and shadow in equal measure. The room's acoustics were also considered. At 42 seats, the table was long enough to seat a small parliament, yet the space was designed so that speeches and toasts would carry clearly from one end to the other. The proportions, the height of the ceiling relative to the length of the room, created a chamber where sound traveled intelligibly without echoing into confusion. This was not accidental. In an age when political alliances were often negotiated over dinner, the ability to hear and be heard was as important as the quality of the wine. Ferdinand's correspondence from this period reveals a man who took these details seriously. Letters to dealers inquire about the provenance of panels and the condition of chair frames. Invoices record payments for gilding, for tapestry restoration, for the commissioning of custom vitrine cases to display smaller treasures in adjoining rooms. The house was still under construction. Roofers worked above, plasterers worked below, but the vision of the dining room was already complete in Ferdinand's mind. It would not be a room that simply fed guests. It would be a room that framed them, that made their presence part of a larger aesthetic and social argument. In the plans, the central chandelier hangs directly above the middle of the table. The room is literally wired around this axis, a geometry of power and light that assumes the diner's importance before they ever sit down. By the time the first guests arrived in 1883, Waddesdon's dining room had become what Ferdinand intended, not a replica of Versailles, but a translation of it, a space where the visual language of royal France was spoken with a Rothschild accent, and where the act of dining became a demonstration that influence, in the modern age, could be constructed as carefully as the buildings that housed it. In the plans, the diners are still blank silhouettes, but the room already assumes their importance. By the spring of 1883, Waddesdon Manor was habitable, though not yet finished. Workmen still moved through the upper floors, completing plasterwork and installing final fixtures, but the ground and first-floor staterooms were ready to receive guests. Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild, now 42 years old and still without an heir, began the social experiment for which the house had been built. He opened Waddesdon to a carefully selected company. The first full house parties were documented not in newspapers — Ferdinand was cautious about publicity — but in his own Red Book, an album of photographs and descriptions compiled in 1897 that fixed Waddesdon's interiors at their peak. The album is now held in the Rothschild archive, and its pages reveal a house at the height of its aesthetic and social ambition. Rooms are shown fully furnished, tapestries in place, vitrines filled with Sèvres porcelain and Renaissance bronzes, and the dining room set as if for a dinner that would begin the moment the photographer withdrew. Guests arrived by train at a private station built on the estate specifically to ease their journey from London. The trains ran on Saturdays, deposited aristocrats and politicians and industrialists at Waddesdon's doorstep, and departed on Mondays, returning them to the city refreshed and often newly allied. The rhythm of the weekend house party, a Victorian social invention that turned leisure into a form of political consultation, was already well established by the 1880s, but Waddesdon refined it into an art. From the station, visitors were driven up the newly planted avenue, past parterres and fountains that had not existed a decade earlier, and into the Oval Hall. The hall, with its soaring ceiling and marble columns, was designed as a threshold between the outside world and the carefully curated interiors beyond. From there, guests moved through the enfilade, drawing room, smoking room, and finally the dining room, each space more richly decorated than the last, each transition marked by a subtle increase in formality and visual density. The dining room itself, when guests finally entered it, was a culmination. The long table, set with the Meissen service reconstructed years later by curators from Ferdinand's own photographs, ran nearly the full length of the room. Silk flowers now stand where fresh roses once filled the air with scent, their petals replaced daily during house parties by a staff whose numbers doubled when guests were in residence. The Beauvais tapestries hung on either side of the overmantel, their pastoral scenes, nymphs and shepherds frozen in eternal leisure, watching over diners whose actual work was the negotiation of loans, the brokering of political alliances, and the management of fortunes that spanned continents. The silver service, originally made for George III, gleamed under the electric chandelier. Footmen moved silently between the chairs, refilling glasses and replacing plates with the choreographed precision of a ballet. The food itself, elaborate multi-course dinners prepared by French chefs imported for the season, was less important than the conversation it enabled. Menus from later house parties, preserved in estate records, list dishes that required hours of preparation: consommés, soufflés, roasted game, ices molded into architectural forms. But the real substance of these meals was not culinary, it was political. Ferdinand, as host, was both participant and orchestrator. He did not dominate conversation. His manner was described by contemporaries as reserved, even melancholic, but he shaped it through the careful construction of the guest list. House parties at Waddesdon in the 1880s brought together men who might not otherwise dine in the same room: liberal unionists and conservatives, industrialists and landed aristocrats, financiers and career diplomats. The common ground was not ideology but ambition, and the tacit understanding that decisions made over dinner at Waddesdon might, in a few weeks or months, become policy in Westminster. The room itself played a role in this. The mirrors on the walls reflected diners back to themselves, a reminder that they were being observed, not by servants who were trained to be invisible, but by each other. The acoustics, carefully calibrated, meant that a toast given at one end of the table could be heard clearly at the other, but that private conversations between neighbors remained private. The lighting, electric by the mid-1880s, a rarity in rural Britain, could be adjusted to suit the mood: bright during the main courses, dimmed for dessert and cigars. One anecdote, recorded in estate histories and later repeated in guidebooks, captures the tone of Waddesdon hospitality. A guest, arriving in the morning after a night of travel, remarked on the extraordinary comfort of the house. Ferdinand replied with characteristic understatement that comfort was the least one could offer. The phrase, polite and nearly dismissive, concealed the infrastructure required to sustain it. A staff of dozens, a private rail station, greenhouses producing flowers and fruit year-round, dairies supplying cream in 3 varieties, and a household budget that exceeded the annual income of many landed estates. By 1889, Waddesdon was no longer a new house but an established one, its place in the social calendar secure. Invitations to the weekend parties were understood in certain circles as markers of rising status. As one later critic observed in a retrospective published in the Jewish Chronicle, invitations to the Waddesdon parties mean that the invited person is a rising member of his profession or is coming to the front in diplomacy or politics. The dining room, in this formulation, was not merely a room but a sorting mechanism, a place where social mobility was tested, observed, and occasionally confirmed. Ferdinand himself, childless and increasingly occupied with his collection, used the house as both refuge and instrument. He was not a man who sought public office or overt political power. Instead, he exercised influence through hospitality, through the careful curation of company, and through the understanding that a well-timed dinner invitation could shift a negotiation or soften a rivalry. The dining room fulfilled its function not through grandeur alone, but through the social architecture it enabled, the conversion of capital into company and company into influence. In Ferdinand's photographs, preserved in the Red Book, the room looks eternal. Tapestries unfaded, silver gleaming, the table set as if guests would arrive at any moment. But in his will, written only a decade later, the house already belongs to the next generation, passed not to a son, he had none, but to his sister Alice, who would guard it with a devotion that bordered on obsession. The dining room had fulfilled its purpose. It had turned appetite into alliance, and a bare hill into a stage where power, for a time, felt permanent. Before moving deeper into the life of the house, it is necessary to step back and situate Waddesdon within the age that created it. The dining room did not appear in isolation. It was part of a larger transformation, reshaping Britain and Europe in the final decades of the 19th century. This was the Gilded Age in America, the Belle Époque in France, and high Victorian imperial Britain, a period when industrial and financial capital generated fortunes of unprecedented scale, and when those fortunes sought expression in architecture, art, and the performance of cultivated leisure. Country houses had always been instruments of power in Britain, but the 1880s marked a shift. The new houses were larger, more expensive, and often built by families whose wealth came not from land, but from railways, mines, and international finance. The Rothschilds were at the center of this transformation. By the 1880s, the family's banking network extended from London and Paris to Vienna, Frankfurt, and Naples. They had financed governments during the Napoleonic Wars, underwrote the British purchase of the Suez Canal in 1875, and brokered loans that stabilized regimes and funded infrastructure across Europe and the Near East. Their wealth was not simply large, it was systemic. A Rothschild loan could determine whether a government survived a budget crisis or a railway reached its destination on time. But wealth of this kind also generated suspicion. In an age marked by rising nationalism and periodic financial panics, the Rothschilds, Jewish, cosmopolitan, and operating across borders, were frequent targets of anti-Semitic caricature and conspiracy theories. They were accused in editorial cartoons and political pamphlets of controlling governments from behind the scenes, of valuing profit over patriotism, and of forming a shadow state that owed allegiance to no nation. Some of these accusations were simply bigotry. Others reflected real anxieties about the power of international finance in an era when capital moved more freely than most people could. Waddesdon, in this context, was both a retreat and a response. It was a place where the Rothschilds could exercise the prerogatives of landed gentry, hosting shooting parties, maintaining gardens, entertaining royalty, without pretending to be anything other than what they were, a Jewish banking family whose fortune had been made in the city, not inherited from feudal estates. The decision to build in the French Renaissance style, rather than the Gothic or Tudor idiom favored by older English families, was a refusal to assimilate fully. Waddesdon announced that the Rothschilds would participate in British country house culture, but on their own terms and in their own aesthetic language. The house also played a role in the shifting politics of the 1880s and 1890s. This was the era of the Irish Home Rule debates, which fractured the Liberal Party and led to the alliance between Liberal Unionists and Conservatives, an alliance in which Ferdinand and his relatives were active, if discreet, participants. The Rothschilds, as a family, supported various political causes. Some members leaned liberal, others conservative, but all understood that their interests, financial stability, free trade, and the maintenance of British imperial power, required careful navigation of parliamentary politics. Country house weekends became, in this period, a space where such navigation occurred. Away from the formality of Parliament and the scrutiny of the press, politicians could speak more freely, test alliances, and broker compromises that would later be formalized in Westminster. Waddesdon's dining room, seating 42 and designed for both intimacy and grandeur, was ideally suited to this purpose. It was large enough to host a significant gathering, but contained enough to allow the host to control the flow of conversation and the mixing of company. The narrator stresses that Waddesdon was not a neutral retreat, but a spatial expression of a financial dynasty whose decisions echoed in ministries and parliaments. When a government sought a loan to fund a colonial railway or stabilize its currency, Rothschild banks in London, Paris, or Vienna were often the first point of contact. When a politician sought advice on financial policy or needed an introduction to a foreign ministry, a weekend at Waddesdon could provide it. The house was, in this sense, an extension of the bank, a place where finance, politics, and social prestige converged in the rituals of hospitality. But Waddesdon was also a statement about the limits of that convergence. No matter how grand the house or how distinguished the guests, the Rothschilds remained, in the eyes of many, outsiders. They could entertain the Prince of Wales and advise prime ministers, but they could not inherit peerages or hold certain ceremonial offices. The dining room, for all its Beauvais tapestries and George III silver, could not erase the social boundaries that wealth alone could not cross. This tension between inclusion and exclusion, between power and acceptance, runs through the history of Waddesdon like a seam in the marble. It is visible in Ferdinand's careful hospitality, in the way he positioned the house as both an English country estate and French château, as both a private retreat and a public demonstration. It is visible, too, in the later history of the house, when the challenges of taxation, war, and changing social attitudes would test whether such a place could survive the forces that created it. For now, in the 1880s, those forces were still in ascendance. Britain was at the height of its imperial power, controlling territories from India to southern Africa to the Caribbean. The financial networks that underwrote that empire, bonds, loans, currency exchanges, were managed, in part, by institutions like the Rothschild banks. And the cultural expression of that power, the country houses, the art collections, the carefully orchestrated weekends, was visible in places like Waddesdon, where a dining room could hold more influence, if only for a weekend, than many government offices. The age that built Waddesdon was confident, expansive, and, in hindsight, precarious. The fortunes made in this era were vast, but they rested on assumptions about the stability of empires, the permanence of social hierarchies, the endless expansion of global trade that would be tested and in some cases shattered in the decades to come. The dining room, for now, glittered, but the chandeliers hung in a world that was already, though few could see it, beginning to shift. By the spring of 1890, Waddesdon Manor had moved from experiment to institution. The house was no longer new, no longer a curiosity. It had become, in the circles that mattered, an expected destination. Invitations were coveted, guest lists were scrutinized, and the dining room had acquired a reputation that extended well beyond Buckinghamshire. In May of that year, Queen Victoria visited. She was 71 years old, in mourning still for Prince Albert, though nearly 3 decades had passed since his death, and increasingly selective about the private houses she would visit. Her acceptance of Ferdinand's invitation was itself a form of endorsement, a public signal that Waddesdon, and by extension the Rothschilds, had achieved a level of social legitimacy that even a Jewish banking family could not take for granted. Victoria arrived by train, was driven through the newly matured gardens, and toured the staterooms with what contemporary accounts describe as genuine interest. She was particularly fascinated by the electric lighting, still a rarity in country houses, and asked to see the lights turned on and off, a request that delighted Ferdinand, whose investment in modern infrastructure had always been as much about demonstrating technological sophistication as providing comfort. Before she departed, the Queen left behind a marble bust of herself, a token of royal approval that was later placed on a side table in the dining room, where it watched over dinners with the same impassive gaze it had once directed at cabinets and parliaments. The bust, though a small object, carried symbolic weight. In a house filled with French 18th-century art and furniture, Beauvais tapestries, Sèvres porcelain, Savonnerie carpets, the presence of a royal British portrait was a reminder that Waddesdon, for all its French aesthetic, was firmly embedded in the structures of British power. The dining room, in particular, reflected this duality. Its design echoed Versailles and the Loire château, but its guest lists were drawn from Westminster and Whitehall. The interiors themselves were by now fully mature. Ferdinand's collection had grown to include not just the dining room service and furnishings, but an extraordinary assemblage of Renaissance treasures, enamels, clocks, and curiosities that filled vitrines in the adjoining rooms. The house had become, in effect, a private museum, though one that still functioned as a residence. Visitors moved through spaces where art and daily life coexisted without clear boundaries, where a Limoges enamel might sit on a mantelpiece next to a vase of fresh flowers, and where a Renaissance bronze could be studied over coffee in the morning room. For Ferdinand, this blending of collection and habitation was intentional. He was not merely a collector, he was a curator of a way of life, one in which beauty, scholarship, and social influence were inseparable. The dining room exemplified this philosophy. It was not simply a place to eat, but a space where aesthetic refinement and political conversation reinforced each other, where the quality of the Meissen service was understood to be part of the same cultural project as the quality of the debate. But Waddesdon's success also underscored one of the paradoxes of the age. A Jewish family, still subject to social prejudice in many quarters, was hosting the very establishment that shaped and perpetuated those prejudices. The dining room made this paradox visible. Here, royal guests sat not as owners but as visitors. The Rothschilds controlled the seating plan, the menu, the conversational topics. In a society where power was traditionally inherited through land and title, Waddesdon demonstrated that it could also be constructed through hospitality, through the strategic deployment of art and architecture, and through the patient accumulation of social capital. One modern writer, reflecting on Waddesdon's role in this period, described it as Britain's Jewish Downton Abbey, a place where social mobility was negotiated over multiple courses and where the rituals of the country house weekend became a mechanism for integrating new wealth into old hierarchies. The comparison, though anachronistic, captures something true about the house's function. Waddesdon was both a stage for assimilation and a platform for asserting difference, a place where the Rothschilds could demonstrate that they belonged while simultaneously making clear that they would not pretend to be anything other than what they were. The central chandelier, reflected in Queen Victoria's bust on a side table, offered a visual echo of this dynamic. Monarchy observed, but not controlling. Royalty honored, but within a house built by financiers. The light that fell on the polished wood and silver did not distinguish between inherited titles and earned fortunes. In the dining room, at least for the duration of the meal, everyone was equal under the chandelier's glow, an equality that was, of course, carefully curated and maintained by the host who paid for the light. Ferdinand himself moved through this world with a combination of pride and restraint. He was not a flamboyant host. Contemporaries described him as thoughtful, somewhat reserved, even melancholic in private. He took pleasure in his collection and in the aesthetic perfection of his interiors. But he understood that Waddesdon's success depended on a careful balance, enough grandeur to impress, enough understatement to avoid the accusation of vulgarity. The house's role in British society also reflected broader changes. By 1890, the country house was no longer the exclusive preserve of the landed aristocracy. New money, from industry, commerce, and finance, was building on a scale that rivaled or exceeded the old estates. Waddesdon was part of this wave, but it stood apart in its self-consciousness, its deliberate construction of a cultural identity that was both English and not English, both traditional and modern. The dining room, in this context, became a kind of laboratory for testing the possibilities and limits of social integration. Could a Jewish banker host a queen? Yes, the bust on the table confirmed it. Could political alliances be formed over dinner as effectively as in parliamentary chambers? The guest lists suggested they could. Could wealth, when deployed with sufficient taste and generosity, overcome the barriers of prejudice and inheritance? The question remained open, but Waddesdon offered a compelling case that it might. On the crest above the door, arms and mottos promised continuity. On the guest list, the future of the British Empire took its seats. And in the reflections of the chandelier, in the multiplied images of candles and crystal, of silver and porcelain, of guests and servants moving through carefully choreographed rituals, the dining room revealed what it had always been, not a place of permanence, but a performance of it, sustained by wealth, will, and the understanding that power, in the modern age, was as much about perception as possession. From the mid-1880s through the Edwardian decade, Ferdinand's weekend house parties became a fixture of British political life. The rhythms were predictable. Guests arrived on Saturday, spent Sunday in conversation or walking the grounds, and departed Monday morning. But the consequences of these weekends, the alliances formed, the policies debated, the compromises reached, rippled outward into Westminster and Whitehall with effects that lasted far beyond the duration of the meal. The dining room was where this alchemy occurred. At Waddesdon, Ferdinand hosted political figures wrestling with the great questions of the era: Irish Home Rule, tariff reform, the future of the empire, the role of the House of Lords in an age of rising democracy. Among the regular guests were Joseph Chamberlain, the liberal unionist, whose break with Gladstone over Home Rule reshaped British politics; Arthur Balfour, who would serve as Prime Minister from 1902 to 1905, and Lord Randolph Churchill, Winston's father, whose brief political career burned brightly in the 1880s before collapsing into illness and obscurity. Later accounts and journalistic retrospectives, compiled decades after the house parties themselves, list at least 5 prime ministers as visitors to Waddesdon: William Gladstone, Lord Rosebery, Arthur Balfour, H. Asquith, and Winston Churchill. The exact dates of their visits are not always recorded. House party guest books were private documents, and Ferdinand was protective of his guests' privacy. But the pattern is clear. Waddesdon, particularly in the 1880s and 1890s, functioned as an informal meeting place for the political class, a space where difficult conversations could occur away from the pressures of party discipline and public scrutiny. The dining room's design facilitated this. Seating 42, it was large enough to accommodate a significant gathering, but intimate enough for conversation to flow naturally. The Beauvais tapestries on the walls provided visual interest without distraction. The Meissen service and George III silver signaled both wealth and a kind of historical continuity, as if the diners were participating in a tradition that stretched back through centuries of political negotiation. The room was acoustically designed so that speeches and toasts traveled clearly from one end of the table to the other, but private conversations between neighbors could remain private, a crucial feature when the guests included political rivals who needed to maintain public opposition while exploring private compromise. The ritualized excess of Rothschild hospitality became legendary. One anecdote, preserved in Bartlett's Book of Anecdotes and repeated in numerous retellings, captures the absurdity and the care embedded in Waddesdon's service. Prime Minister H. Asquith, waking in his guest room after a night at Waddesdon, was greeted by the butler with an extraordinary cascade of choices. Would he prefer tea or coffee? If tea, would he prefer Indian, Ceylon, or China, or perhaps a peach from the wall? If milk was desired with the tea, would he prefer it from Jersey, Hereford, or Shorthorn cows? The anecdote, humorous in its elaboration, also reveals something serious. The extent to which Waddesdon's hospitality was constructed as a demonstration of control, not authoritarian control, but the control that comes from anticipating every possible need and preference, from creating an environment where comfort was so complete that guests could focus entirely on the conversations and alliances that had brought them to Buckinghamshire in the first place. The meals themselves were elaborate affairs. Menus from later house parties, preserved in estate records, list courses that would have required hours of preparation, consommes clarified to perfect transparency, fish poached and sauced with precision, roasted game from the estate's own shoots, soufflés that rose and fell according to kitchen clocks, ices molded into architectural forms. French chefs, imported for the season, worked in kitchens that had been designed with the same care as the dining room above. High ceilings for ventilation, tiled surfaces for hygiene, separate stations for different courses, and a staff hierarchy that ensured each dish arrived at the table at the correct temperature and the correct moment. But the food, elaborate as it was, served mainly as a framework for conversation. The real substance of these dinners was political. In the 1880s and early 1890s, the central debate in British politics was Irish Home Rule, Gladstone's proposal to grant Ireland a degree of legislative autonomy within the United Kingdom. The proposal split the Liberal Party, with Liberal Unionists, including Chamberlain, breaking away to form an alliance with the Conservatives. Waddesdon, during these years, hosted meetings that helped solidify that alliance, bringing together politicians who agreed on opposing Home Rule even as they disagreed on other issues. Ferdinand's role in these conversations was subtle. He was not a politician himself, and he did not deliver speeches or write policy papers, but he controlled the environment in which policy was debated. He decided who sat next to whom, who was invited for which weekend, and when conversations should be allowed to continue late into the night, and when they should be gently redirected toward less contentious topics. His influence was curatorial, not executive, but in an age when so much of politics occurred outside the formal chambers of government, the curator's role mattered. The camera follows a decanter being passed from hand to hand, the reflections of political faces distorted in the glass as it moves along the table. The decanter, filled with claret or port, is heavy. It requires a steady hand to pass it without spilling. The faces reflected in its curved surface, older men mostly, dressed in evening clothes, are elongated and shadowed, briefly visible before the decanter moves on. It is an image that captures the fluidity of Waddesdon's political culture. Conversations passed like the decanter, from hand to hand, from guest to guest, with each participant adding their own inflection before passing the topic along. The historian notes that, officially, decisions were made at Westminster. Unofficially, they were rehearsed in places like this, over courses and cigars. The dining room at Waddesdon did not replace Parliament, it complemented it, providing a space where political figures could speak more candidly, test ideas before proposing them publicly, and build the personal relationships that would later make legislative compromise possible. The conversations that occurred here were not recorded in Hansard, the official parliamentary record, but they shaped what later appeared there. No treaty was signed on the table's polished surface, but many votes were counted there in advance. The dining room was not a site of formal decision-making, but it was a site of preparation, of alignment, of the slow work of turning individual positions into collective policy. The Meissen plates, cleared after each course, carried away not just the remnants of the meal, but the residue of disagreements softened, alliances tentatively formed, and compromises sketched out in the neutral language of hypotheticals and future possibilities. By the end of the 1890s, Waddesdon's role as a political salon was well established. The house was no longer an upstart, it was an institution. And the dining room, with its tapestries and chandeliers, its silver and porcelain, had become a recognizable stage in British public life. Recognizable, that is, to the small circle of people who moved between country houses, parliamentary chambers, and the private clubs of Pall Mall. For everyone else, Waddesdon remained largely invisible, its political influence exerted quietly, its dinners undocumented except in private correspondence and decades later memoirs. To understand the dining room's grandeur, it is necessary to step outside it, to see the machinery that made each dinner possible. By the 1890s, Waddesdon was not simply a house, but a small, self-contained estate economy, employing hundreds of people and consuming resources on a scale that would have supported an entire village. The gardens alone, laid out by the French landscape designer Aylesbury between 1874 and the early 1890s, were a monumental undertaking. Linné transformed Lodge Hill's bare slopes into a series of terraced parterres, rockwork designed by James Poolham, ornamental fountains, and tree-lined avenues that guided visitors from the station to the house. Creating the garden cost $153, a sum equivalent to tens of millions of pounds when measured against average wages today. The figure, preserved in estate accounts, is almost abstract in its scale, but it translated into tangible things: tons of soil moved, hundreds of mature trees transplanted, miles of irrigation piping laid beneath the lawns, and glass houses erected to produce flowers and fruit year-round. Inside those glass houses, gardeners cultivated roses for the dining room table, peaches for breakfast trays, and exotic plants for the conservatory displays. The flowers that appeared in the dining room vases, changed daily during house parties, were grown on site, their blooms timed to coincide with the arrival of guests. The estate's kitchen gardens supplied vegetables. The dairy provided milk from Jersey, Hereford, and Shorthorn cattle, each breed kept separate so that guests could express a preference. The game served at dinner came from Waddesdon's own shoots, managed by gamekeepers who bred pheasants and maintained the woodlands specifically for Ferdinand's hunting parties. This infrastructure was not unique to Waddesdon. Many great estates in this period operated as semi-independent economic units, producing much of what they consumed and employing large staffs to maintain the illusion of effortless abundance. But Waddesdon operated at a scale and with a level of investment that set it apart. Ferdinand was not interested in making the estate profitable. He was interested in making it perfect. The cost of perfection, in this case, was measured not just in money but in labor. Staff lists from the 1890s, preserved in estate records, show the human infrastructure behind each dinner. Inside the house, a butler, under-butlers, footmen, housemaids, ladies' maids, kitchen staff including a French chef and multiple assistants, a housekeeper, and various specialists responsible for maintaining the collection, cleaners trained to handle porcelain without breaking it, conservators who monitored the tapestries for fading or insect damage. Outside, gardeners, gamekeepers, stable staff, dairy workers, estate carpenters, masons, and a small army of general laborers who maintained the drives, cleared the woods, and performed the countless tasks required to keep a château and its grounds looking immaculate. During house parties, staff numbers doubled. Additional footmen were hired from London, temporary kitchen assistants were brought in to handle the increased volume of cooking, and housemaids worked extended hours to prepare guest rooms, lay fires, and ensure that every surface gleamed. The work was exhausting, the hours long, and the wages, while above average for rural Buckinghamshire, modest compared to the wealth they served. Guides in later histories note that whole trains were chartered to deliver guests and supplies. Waddesdon's private station, built specifically to ease access from London, saw regular traffic during the social season: carriages loaded with luggage, hampers of provisions from London shops, crates of wine from the estate's cellars, and guests who arrived expecting everything to be ready upon their arrival. The logistics of coordinating these deliveries, of ensuring that the right people and the right goods arrived at the right times, required a level of administrative sophistication that rivaled a small business. The milk from the Jersey, Hereford, and Shorthorn cattle ended up in the silver jugs on the dining table. The countryside literally poured into porcelain up above. This connection between the rural labor below and the urban sophistication above was rarely acknowledged by the diners themselves. The cream in the coffee, the roses in the vases, the firewood stacked beside each guest room fireplace, all appeared as if by magic, their origins invisible to those who consumed them. Yet the estate wage books, preserved alongside the guest lists, tell a different story. They record overtime hours during house parties, seasonal hiring patterns, and the small economies that made the larger economy possible. Children employed to scare birds from the kitchen gardens, women hired to do laundry in dedicated buildings separate from the main house, men, paid by the day to repair roads or clear ditches. The perfect weekends documented in Ferdinand's Red Book photographs rested on these invisible foundations. Ferdinand was not unaware of this. He was, by the standards of his class, a considerate employer. He provided housing for estate workers, paid for medical care, and contributed to pension funds, practices that were not universal among Victorian landowners. But consideration does not erase the fundamental relationship. Waddesdon's existence, its beauty, its function as a political salon, depended on the labor of people who would never sit at the dining room table, who would never be named in the guest books, and whose work was valued precisely to the extent that it remained invisible. The narrator reflects on how Waddesdon demonstrates the invisible conversion rate between global finance, rural labor, and urban politics. What appears as effortless elegance is underwritten by layers of extraction and service. The Rothschild fortune came from banking, from lending money to governments, underwriting railway bonds, financing mining operations in distant colonies. That fortune, in turn, sustained Waddesdon, which sustained the dining room, which hosted the politicians who shaped the policies that determined which governments received loans, which railways were built, and which colonies were exploited. The circle was closed, though rarely acknowledged. Inside the dining room, the conversion was complete. The labor became invisible, the finance became hospitality, and the hospitality became influential. Guests who dined at Waddesdon saw only the final product, the polished table, the gleaming silver, the perfectly timed courses. They did not see the gamekeepers who rose before dawn, the kitchen staff who worked through the night, the gardeners who cultivated flowers in heated glasshouses while winter winds stripped the trees outside. The dining room was designed to make this work disappear, to create the illusion that beauty and comfort simply existed without cost or consequence. But the cost was real, and it was documented in the very archives that celebrated the house's grandeur. The same estate records that preserved photographs of the dining room also recorded wages paid, hours worked, and the seasonal rhythms of employment that governed the lives of everyone who did not dine at the table. The house, in this sense, was a monument not just to wealth, but to the social structure that wealth depended on, a structure in which some people designed châteaux and others laid the stones, some people commissioned silver services and others polished them, some people sat beneath chandeliers and others replaced the bulbs when they burned out. In the guest books, these were perfect weekends. In the wage books, they were overtime. When Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild died on December 17, 1898, at the age of 58, Waddesdon passed not to a son, he had none, but to his sister Alice. She was 53 years old, unmarried, and had lived much of her adult life in her brother's shadow, sharing his aesthetic passions and his commitment to the house they had both, in different ways, shaped. Alice de Rothschild was not a caretaker. She was a guardian. From 1898 until her death in 1922, she maintained Waddesdon with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She did not significantly alter Ferdinand's interiors. She understood that the house's power lay in its completeness, in the coherence of its aesthetic vision, but she enforced rules designed to preserve them. Smoking was banned in most rooms. Later anecdotes recall Winston Churchill being forced to smoke on the balcony of the portico room to evade her prohibition. Visitors were instructed not to touch the furniture, not to stand too close to the tapestries, not to lean against the vitrines. The house, under Alice, began its transformation from residence to museum, though it would take another 50 years for that transformation to become official. The dining room continued to host gatherings, but on a reduced scale. Photographs from Alice's tenure, preserved in the Rothschild archive, show tables set for fewer guests, sometimes 12, sometimes 20, and a subtle shift in the room's use. The grand political weekends of Ferdinand's era became less frequent. Alice entertained family, close friends, and selected associates, but the dining room's role as a salon for parliamentary negotiation faded. This was partly a matter of Alice's temperament. She was more private than her brother, less interested in the tactical work of political hospitality. But it also reflected larger changes in British society. By the early 1900s, the country house weekend was no longer the exclusive preserve of the aristocracy and the political elite. Middle-class professionals, industrialists, and a new generation of politicians from less privileged backgrounds were reshaping the social landscape. The tight circle of families who had moved between each other's estates in the 1880s was fragmenting. Taxation, particularly after the Liberal government's People's Budget of 1909, made it more expensive to maintain houses on Waddesdon scale. The cost of employing large staff, heating vast rooms, and keeping gardens immaculate began to weigh even on families as wealthy as the Rothschilds. Alice's response was to tighten her control. She reduced the number of house parties, closed off parts of the house during winter months to save on heating, and became increasingly selective about who was invited. The dining room, which had once been lit almost every weekend during the season, now sat dark for longer periods. The chandelier's crystals gathered dust between cleanings. The Meissen service was used less often. The silver, polished weekly whether or not it was needed, began to feel like a ritual performed more for memory than for function. Yet Alice's stewardship was also an act of preservation. Other great houses in this period were being sold, subdivided, or demolished. The economic pressures that began with taxation and accelerated with the First World War destroyed many estates that had seemed permanent only a generation earlier. Alice, by reducing Waddesdon's social ambitions, ensured its survival. She spent her own fortune maintaining the house and gardens, funding repairs, and adding to the collection, though at a slower pace than Ferdinand had. She understood, perhaps more clearly than her brother, that Waddesdon's future depended not on its continued use as a political salon, but on its preservation as a cultural artifact. The chandelier was now lit less often. Dust motes became more visible in the photographs, a subtle hint of entropy. In images taken during Alice's tenure, the dining room retains its grandeur, but feels less inhabited. The table is set, the tapestries hang straight, the mirrors reflect empty chairs. The room has begun to slip from present tense into past tense, from active space into memorial. Alice's personality shaped this transition. Contemporaries described her as formidable, exacting, and deeply attached to the routines and rituals that Ferdinand had established. She walked through the house daily, inspecting rooms, checking that curtains were drawn to protect fabrics from sunlight, ensuring that flowers were fresh and fireplaces were swept. She maintained a detailed inventory of the collection, noting the condition of objects and arranging for conservation when needed. She corresponded with curators, dealers, and scholars, positioning herself as the authority on Waddesdon's contents and its history. But she was also isolated. Ferdinand, for all his reserve, had been a social figure, comfortable hosting and navigating the complex etiquette of country house weekends. Alice was less comfortable in that role. She preferred smaller gatherings, intimate dinners with family or long-standing friends. The dining room, designed for 42, often seated far fewer. The scale of the room began to feel excessive, the grandeur slightly oppressive, the empty chairs a reminder of conversations that no longer occurred. This shift was not mourned at the time. Houses adapt to their owners, and Alice's Waddesdon was simply different from Ferdinand's. But in retrospect, it marks a turning point. The dining room had ceased to be an engine of politics and had become something rarer, a capsule of a vanished decade, preserved almost intact. Under Alice's stewardship, Waddesdon began to function less as a stage for the present and more as a monument to the past, a past that even in the 1900s and 1910s was starting to feel distant. The narrator suggests that Alice was already acting as a curator rather than a social hostess, anticipating the house's future as a museum. This was not a conscious decision, at least not initially. Alice wanted to live in the house, to use it, to maintain it as Ferdinand had left it. But her methods, her emphasis on preservation, her restrictions on access, her detailed documentation of the collection, were the methods of a curator. She was preparing Waddesdon for a future she might not have fully imagined, but was unconsciously creating. A future in which the house would belong not to a family, but to the public, not to the living, but to memory. When Alice died in 1922, the house passed to James Armand de Rothschild, her great-nephew from the French branch of the family. The transition was smoother than it might have been. James inherited not just the house, but Alice's sense of responsibility toward it. But by 1922, the world in which Waddesdon had been built was gone. The First World War had shattered the assumptions of the Gilded Age, and the dining room, for all its beauty, belonged to an era that could no longer be revived. Under Alice, the dining room ceased to be an engine of politics and became something rarer, a capsule of a vanished decade, preserved almost intact. The First World War arrived in August 1914, and though Waddesdon was far from the trenches, the house did not escape the conflict. The war reshaped Britain's economy, its politics, and its social structure in ways that would take decades to fully manifest. For country houses, the immediate effects were felt in taxation, labor shortages, and the quiet recognition that the world in which they had been built was ending. Waddesdon survived the war years, but it survived as a different kind of place. Parts of the house were closed to save fuel, staff numbers were reduced as younger men enlisted or were conscripted. The gardens, though still maintained, were simplified. The dining room saw fewer dinners, and when it was used, the gatherings were smaller, more somber. The conversations around the table shifted from colonial expansion and tariff policy to casualty lists and the logistics of war production. Alice, still the house's primary resident until her death in 1922, adapted Waddesdon to the times. The estate contributed to the war effort in modest ways. Gardens produced vegetables for local markets, the workshops repaired equipment, and parts of the house were made available for war-related meetings. But the grand political weekends of the 1880s and 1890s did not resume. The politicians who had once gathered at Waddesdon were either dead, too old, or preoccupied with crises that made weekend hospitality seem frivolous. After the war, Britain faced a reckoning. The conflict had been financed through borrowing and taxation, and the debt had to be repaid. The post-war governments, liberal and then conservative, increased taxes on wealth, particularly on inherited estates. Death duties, which had been modest in the Victorian era, became substantial. Many landed families, already struggling with reduced agricultural incomes, found that they could not afford to maintain large houses. Between 1918 and 1939, hundreds of country houses were demolished, their contents sold at auction, their parks subdivided for housing or returned to agricultural use. Country Life magazine, which had spent decades celebrating these houses, began documenting what it called the Lost Houses epoch, a period of destruction that, in retrospect, looks like the architectural equivalent of a mass extinction. Waddesdon survived, but survival required adaptation. James Armand de Rothschild, who inherited the house from Alice in 1922, understood that Waddesdon could not continue as it had. He and his wife, Dorothy, used the house for residence and entertaining, but on a reduced scale. The full-scale house parties of Ferdinand's era, with their dozens of guests and elaborate logistics, were no longer feasible, or perhaps no longer desirable. The social world that had sustained those parties had fragmented. The tight networks of aristocratic and political families had been disrupted by war, death, and social change. The dining room, during James and Dorothy's tenure, was used primarily for family gatherings and occasional formal dinners. Photographs from the 1920s and 1930s show the table laid for smaller groups, often fewer than 20. The Meissen service and George III's silver were still used, but the room's grandeur began to feel disproportionate to its function. The tapestries, the mirrors, the chandelier, all were maintained, but they no longer framed the kind of conversations that had given the room its political significance. At the same time, Waddesdon played a different role. During and after the wars, the house hosted evacuees and Jewish orphans, part of the estate's humanitarian work. The Rothschild family, as a whole, was deeply involved in efforts to support Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Europe, and Waddesdon became one of many sites where that support was expressed concretely. The dining room saw quiet meals for children who had fled Vienna or Berlin, committee meetings for relief organizations, and gatherings that had nothing to do with politics or high society, but everything to do with survival. The family's political influence also changed form. In November 1917, Walter Rothschild, James's cousin, received a letter at his London address from Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour. The letter, later known as the Balfour Declaration, expressed British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The declaration was brief, fewer than 70 words, but its consequences were immense, shaping the future of the Middle East and the eventual creation of the State of Israel. Decades later, the letter and related documents appeared in exhibitions at Waddesdon, linking the house to the history of Zionism and to debates that continue into the present. This connection between Waddesdon and the Balfour Declaration is complex. The Rothschilds did not write British policy, but they were consulted, their opinions mattered, and their financial and political networks gave them access to decision-makers. The dining room at Waddesdon had hosted some of the same politicians who negotiated the declaration. The weekends, spent discussing Irish Home Rule in the 1880s, had their distant echo in the conversations about Palestine in the 1910s. The house, in this sense, remained connected to the machinery of power, even as that machinery itself was changing. But by 1939, the dining room's role had fundamentally shifted. The conversations around the table were no longer about railway shares and empire, but about refugees and rationing. The Second World War, when it came, confirmed what the First World War had begun, the end of the world in which Waddesdon had been conceived. The house survived both wars physically intact, but its social and cultural function had been irrevocably altered. Archival footage and photographs from the post-war period show the dining table laid with more modest arrangements. The full Meissen service is still present, but the meals are simpler, the guest lists shorter. The room, though still beautiful, feels like a stage set, waiting for a performance that will not occur. The chandelier hangs as it always has, but the light it casts now illuminates fewer faces, and those faces belong to a different era. An era in which the country house weekend, as Ferdinand had practiced it, had become a historical curiosity rather than a living institution. The narrator points out that while many contemporaries lost their houses entirely, Waddesdon's survival owed as much to philanthropy and adaptation as to wealth. The Rothschilds could have sold the house, could have walked away from the costs and complications of maintaining a château in post-war Britain. That they chose not to, that they continued to invest in Waddesdon's preservation even as its original function faded, speaks to a sense of responsibility that went beyond financial calculation. By 1939, the dining room still glittered, but the conversations around the table were no longer about railway shares and empire, but about refugees and rationing. When Alice de Rothschild died in 1922, she left Waddesdon to her great-nephew James Armand de Rothschild, a member of the French branch of the family. The inheritance, carefully structured to avoid the fragmentation that had destroyed other estates, meant that Waddesdon would continue as a single unified property rather than being divided among multiple heirs or sold to pay death duties. James Armand de Rothschild was born in Paris in 1878, the son of Edmond de Rothschild, who had funded early Jewish settlements in Palestine. James had served in the British Army during the First World War, had married an Englishwoman, Dorothy Pinto, and had settled in England permanently. His inheritance of Waddesdon was not automatic. Alice could have left the house elsewhere, but it made sense within the family's logic. James understood what the house represented, and he had the resources and the commitment to maintain it. But maintaining Waddesdon in the 1920s and 1930s was a different proposition than it had been in the 1880s. Death duties, though carefully managed, took a significant portion of Alice's estate. The ongoing costs of running the house, staff salaries, heating, repairs, garden maintenance, were substantial, and the income from the estate's agricultural land was no longer sufficient to cover them. James and Dorothy subsidized the house from their own fortunes, and they began the slow process of rethinking what Waddesdon could be in the 20th century. One of the most significant changes was a reduction in the scale of formal entertainment. The dining room, designed for 42, was increasingly used for family dinners, smaller gatherings, and occasional events that, while still elegant, lacked the political significance of Ferdinand's weekends. James and Dorothy entertained friends, hosted charity events, and used the house for family celebrations. But they did not attempt to revive the salon culture of the 1890s. That world had ended, and they knew it. Instead, they focused on preservation. James, like Ferdinand and Alice before him, was a collector, and he continued to add to Waddesdon's holdings, though at a slower pace and with a more curatorial eye. He understood that the collection was no longer just a private treasure, but a cultural asset that might, eventually, need to be shared with the public. He catalogued acquisitions, consulted with scholars, and began to think about the house's future beyond his own lifetime. The dining table, during this period, was often laid for smaller family groups. Some of the Meissen in silver was moved, cleaned, catalogued, or loaned to exhibitions. The room became less a theater of politics and more a container of heirlooms, a space where the objects mattered as much as, or more than, the people who used them. This shift was gradual and undocumented in any single decision, but it is visible in the photographic record. Images from the 1930s and 1940s show the dining room set with care, but used infrequently, its grandeur increasingly at odds with the reduced scale of domestic life at Waddesdon. House accounts from this period, preserved in the estate archives, note the decline in full-scale house parties and the partial closure of parts of the house outside the summer season. Rooms were shut up to save on heating, staff numbers were further reduced, gardens that had once required dozens of full-time gardeners were maintained by smaller crews who focused on the most visible areas. Waddesdon was contracting, not in physical size but in the intensity of its use. Dorothy de Rothschild, James's wife, played a significant role in this transition. She was less interested in collecting than her husband, but she understood the practical challenges of maintaining a house like Waddesdon. She oversaw the household management, negotiated with staff, and managed the budgets that kept the estate functioning. Her approach was pragmatic rather than romantic. She loved the house, but she did not sentimentalize it. When rooms needed to be closed or staff reduced, she made those decisions without hesitation. The narrator emphasizes that decline here is administrative as much as physical, a slow recalibration of what a family can afford to be. Waddesdon did not crumble. Its walls did not crack. Its roof did not leak. But the infrastructure that had sustained it as a social institution, the large staff, the constant entertaining, the assumption that resources were unlimited, gradually eroded. What remained was a beautiful house, impeccably maintained, but no longer operating at the scale or with the social centrality that Ferdinand had envisioned. James understood this transition better than most. He had lived through 2 world wars, had seen the collapse of monarchies and empires, and had witnessed the dissolution of the social order that had created houses like Waddesdon. He did not mourn these changes in any public way, but he took steps to ensure that Waddesdon would survive them. In his will, drafted in the 1950s, he made a decision that would define the house's future. He left Waddesdon not to a family member, but to the National Trust, with an endowment to maintain it in perpetuity. The decision was both practical and symbolic. Practically, it solved the problem of succession and ensured that the house would not be sold or demolished after his death. Symbolically, it acknowledged that Waddesdon's significance had moved beyond the family. It was no longer just a Rothschild house. It was, in James's view, a cultural monument that belonged, in some sense, to the nation. The dining room, under James's stewardship, became a bridge between 2 eras. It retained its Meissen service, its Beauvais tapestries, its George III silver, all the material markers of Ferdinand's vision. But it no longer functioned as Ferdinand had intended. The politicians who had once dined there were dead or retired. The issues that had been debated over its table, home rule, tariff reform, imperial policy, had either been resolved or rendered obsolete by history. What remained was a beautifully preserved interior that documented a way of life that had ended. Where earlier generations used Waddesdon to demonstrate that the Rothschilds could live like princes, James quietly recognized that no one could live like this forever. The admission, implicit rather than spoken, marked a turning point. Waddesdon would survive, but not as a residence in the traditional sense. It would survive as something else, a museum, a trust property, a place where the past was kept intact not for private enjoyment, but for public education. The dining room, in this context, became a kind of time capsule, a space where the objects and arrangements of the 1880s and 1890s were maintained with curatorial precision, even as the people who had once used them moved further into history. On February 7, 1957, James de Rothschild died at the age of 78. His will, read shortly thereafter, was explicit and unambiguous. Waddesdon Manor, its grounds and its contents, were to be given to the National Trust with an endowment to maintain them in perpetuity. The bequest included not just the house and collection, but also the gardens, the surrounding parkland, and the financial resources necessary to ensure that the estate could be maintained as a single integrated whole. The National Trust accepted the bequest, and the process of transferring ownership began. It was not a simple transaction. Legal arrangements had to be made, the collection had to be inventoried, and the house had to be prepared for its new role. In 1959, Waddesdon Manor opened to the public for the first time. Around 27,000 visitors came in the first year, a number that would grow steadily in the decades that followed. The opening marked a profound transformation. Waddesdon had always been, in some sense, a semi-public space. Its gardens had occasionally been opened for charity events, and Ferdinand had been generous in allowing scholars and curators to study parts of the collection. But it had remained, fundamentally, a private residence controlled by the family and accessible only to invited guests. Now, for the first time, anyone willing to pay the modest admission fee could walk through the staterooms, stand in the dining room, and see the Meissen service laid out on the table. The National Trust's management of Waddesdon was unusual. Typically, when a property was transferred to the trust assumed full control of its administration. But James's bequest included a provision that gave the Rothschild family a continuing role. The house would be managed through what eventually became the Rothschild Foundation, which retained curatorial authority over the interiors and the collection. This arrangement meant that Waddesdon, even as a National Trust property, remained more closely connected to the donor's family than most other trust houses. For the dining room, the transformation was both physical and conceptual. Physically, the room was prepared for public viewing. Rope barriers were installed to keep visitors at a respectful distance from the table and the furniture. Interpretive labels were added, providing information about the tapestries, the porcelain, and the room's history. The lighting was adjusted to reduce the risk of damage to fabrics and paintings while still allowing visitors to appreciate the space. Conservation protocols were established, humidity and temperature were monitored, and access was controlled to prevent overcrowding. Conceptually, the room shifted from being a functional space, a place where meals occurred, to being a representation of a functional space. The table was now permanently set, as if for a dinner that would never quite happen. The arrangement of plates, glasses, and cutlery was based on Ferdinand's own photographs from the 1890s, recreated with curatorial precision. Silk flowers replaced the fresh roses that had once scented the room. The chandelier was lit during visiting hours, but it no longer illuminated actual conversations. Instead, it lit the memory of conversations, the idea of what had once occurred beneath its crystals. Early National Trust photographs from 1959 and the 1960s show visitors moving cautiously through the room, staying behind the ropes, reading the labels, and occasionally glancing at the ceiling or the tapestries with expressions of curiosity or admiration. The atmosphere is respectful, almost reverential, appropriate for a space that had hosted queens and prime ministers, but also slightly subdued. The room, for all its grandeur, had become a museum exhibit, and the guests had become visitors. This transformation was not unique to Waddesdon. Many country houses facing similar economic pressures opened to the public in the post-war decades. Some, like Chatsworth and Blenheim, remained in family ownership and opened their doors to generate income. Others, like Waddesdon, were transferred to institutions like the National Trust, which preserved them as cultural heritage sites. The country house in the mid-20th century was being redefined, from a private residence and a site of social power to a public monument and a tourist destination. But Waddesdon's transformation was particularly striking because of the completeness of its preservation. Many houses, when they opened to the public, had already lost parts of their collections to sales or had been altered to accommodate institutional uses. Waddesdon, by contrast, remained largely as James had left it. The dining room, the drawing rooms, Ferdinand's study, all were intact, their furnishings and arrangements documented and maintained. The house became, in effect, a museum of itself, a place where visitors could see not just objects, but an entire way of life, frozen at a particular historical moment. The narrator reflects that the dining room has undergone a profound transformation, from a place where decisions were made to a place where decisions are remembered. This shift, though subtle, is fundamental. The room no longer generates influence. Instead, it represents influence. It no longer brings people together for the purpose of negotiation or alliance. Instead, it educates people about how negotiation and alliance once occurred. The power that the room once contained has evaporated, leaving behind only its aesthetic shell and the stories told by curators and guidebooks. By the time coach parties queued outside the front door, the dining room's most powerful guest was no longer a prime minister, but the anonymous visitor with a guidebook. This line captures the inversion that public opening represents. The room that had been designed to exclude, to admit only the carefully selected few, was now open to anyone. The table that had seated cabinet ministers now seated no one, but was viewed by thousands, clerks, teachers, retirees, school children, who would never have been invited in Ferdinand's time. The transformation was, in many ways, democratic. Knowledge of the house and its collection, once the privilege of a small elite, became accessible to a much wider public. But it was also elegiac. The room had lost the thing that had made it significant, its use. It had become a beautiful, carefully maintained relic, admired and studied, but no longer alive in the way it had been when the chandeliers lit actual faces and the table held actual conversations. Waddesdon, in 1959, entered a new phase of its existence, a phase in which preservation replaced use and memory replaced experience. The dining room, at the center of this transformation, became the most visible symbol of what the house had been and what it had become. Between 1990 and 1997, under the leadership of Jacob Rothschild, the fourth Baron Rothschild, Waddesdon underwent a major restoration. The house, though well maintained by National Trust standards, had accumulated decades of minor deterioration. Roofs needed repair, services required upgrading, and the interiors, particularly Ferdinand's original staterooms, needed conservation to return them as closely as possible to their 1890s appearance. The restoration was both technical and scholarly. Teams of conservators, architects, and historians worked together to understand how the rooms had originally been arranged, what colors the walls had been painted, how the furniture had been positioned, and which objects had been displayed where. Ferdinand's Red Book, the photographic album from 1897, became a crucial document. Its images provided precise visual evidence of the rooms at their peak, and conservators used these photographs to guide their work, matching paint colors to faded patches visible in the images, repositioning furniture to match the arrangements shown, and even recreating decorative details that had been lost or altered over the decades. The dining room received particular attention. The Beauvais tapestries were examined and conserved, their colors stabilized and their backing reinforced. The marble dados were cleaned, revealing the original veining of the stone beneath a century of accumulated grime. The chandelier was taken down, each crystal cleaned and repaired, the wiring checked and updated to modern standards while maintaining the historical appearance. The Meissen service was catalogued anew, each piece inspected for damage and recorded in a digital database that would allow curators to track its condition over time. But restoration also revealed fragility. Conservation reports from this period, preserved in the Waddesdon archives, show that the dining room's textiles, gilding, and furniture required constant monitoring. Light damage was a persistent concern. Even indirect sunlight could, over time, fade the tapestries and the silk upholstery. Fluctuations in humidity threatened the wooden furniture, causing joints to loosen and veneers to crack. Visitor numbers, which had grown steadily since 1959, posed their own risks. The movement of hundreds of thousands of people through the house each year introduced dust, raised humidity levels through breath and body heat, and created vibrations that, while individually minor, accumulated into structural stress. The table that once symbolized invulnerability now needed elaborate protection. Conservators measured light levels on the Meissen service, ensuring that no piece was exposed to more than 50 lux of illumination, a level low enough to prevent damage but high enough for visitors to see the details. The chandelier's bulbs were replaced with LEDs that produced less heat and emitted less ultraviolet radiation. The rope barriers around the table were carefully positioned to keep visitors far enough away that accidental contact was impossible, but close enough that the room's scale and beauty remained appreciable. In 2003, the vulnerability of even the most secure collections was demonstrated when the Johnson Gang, a group of thieves specializing in high-value burglaries, broke into Waddesdon and stole around 100 gold boxes and small objects from the collection. The theft, carried out with sophisticated planning and inside knowledge, was a shock to the trust in the Rothschild Foundation. Most of the stolen objects were eventually recovered, but the burglary prompted a major investment in security. New alarm systems, reinforced locks, surveillance cameras, and trained security staff. The dining room, though not directly targeted, benefited from these upgrades, its contents now monitored 24 hours a day. The narrator notes that in the late 20th century, the greatest threat to the house was not revolutionary politics or aerial bombardment, but time, theft, and tourism. This observation, though understated, captures the shift in what preservation means. Ferdinand had built Waddesdon to project permanence, to demonstrate that wealth and taste could create something lasting. But permanence, it turned out, was an illusion. The house survived not because it was invulnerable, but because it was constantly defended against decay, against thieves, against the slow erosion that affects all material things. A conservator gently dusts the chandelier, working from a scaffolding platform erected for the task. Another measures light levels on the Meissen service, holding a handheld lux meter above each plate, recording the readings in a logbook that will be reviewed later by the conservation team. These actions, mundane and repetitive, are the reality of preservation. The dining room's beauty is not self-sustaining. It is maintained through continuous, careful labor. The restoration of the 1990s also included interpretive updates. New guidebooks were written, incorporating recent scholarship on the Rothschilds, on 19th-century decorative arts, and on the social history of the country house. The dining room's labels, once focused primarily on describing the objects, were expanded to include context. Who had dined here, what political conversations had occurred, how the room had functioned as a social space. Visitors were encouraged to see the room not just as a collection of beautiful things, but as evidence of a particular historical moment, a moment when architecture, art, and hospitality intersected to create a form of power that was both real and ephemeral. But the labels also posed a challenge. How much context was appropriate? Should the interpretive materials mention the Rothschilds' role in international finance, and if so, how? Should they address the anti-Semitism the family faced or the criticisms leveled at the country house as an institution? Should they acknowledge the labor that had sustained the house or the imperial networks that had generated the wealth to build it? Jacob Rothschild, overseeing the restoration, took the position that Waddesdon should be presented honestly and comprehensively. The house was a monument to a particular kind of wealth and a particular historical era, and visitors deserved to understand both the beauty and the complexity of what they were seeing. The dining room, in this framework, was not just an aesthetic achievement, but a historical document, one that raised questions about power, taste, class, and the relationship between private wealth and public culture. In insurance documents and environmental graphs, the dining room becomes what it always was: fragile. The chandeliers, the tapestries, the Meissen plates, all are vulnerable to forces that wealth cannot ultimately control. Fire, flood, theft, decay. Each is a possibility. Each must be guarded against. The dining room's survival, in the 21st century, depends not on Ferdinand's vision or the family's fortune, but on the daily work of conservators, security staff, and administrators who understand that preservation is a never-ending task. The room has become what preservation always reveals, not a triumph over time, but a negotiation with it. In 2017, Waddesdon Manor marked the centenary of the Balfour Declaration with an exhibition titled Balfour 100. The exhibition, drawn from the Waddesdon archive and supplemented by loans from other Rothschild collections, displayed documents related to the letter Arthur Balfour sent to Walter Rothschild in November 1917. The letter, fewer than 70 words long, expressed British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, a statement that would shape the Middle East for the next century and contribute to the eventual creation of the State of Israel. The exhibition was controversial in ways that earlier displays at Waddesdon had not been. The Balfour Declaration, though a historical document, remains a subject of intense debate. For supporters of Israel, it is a foundational text, a moment when international recognition of Jewish national aspirations became official policy. For critics, particularly those sympathetic to Palestinian perspectives, it is a document that facilitated displacement and conflict, a colonial-era promise made without consulting the people already living in Palestine. The exhibition attempted to present the document in historical context, showing the political calculations that led to its drafting, the networks through which it was negotiated, and the consequences it set in motion. The dining room played a supporting role in this narrative. While the exhibition itself was housed in other parts of the estate, the interpretive materials reminded visitors that the dining room had hosted some of the same politicians who negotiated British policy in the Middle East. The weekend parties of the 1880s and 1890s, where Irish Home Rule and imperial policy were debated, had their echo in the conversations about Zionism and Palestine in the 1910s. The house, in this sense, remained connected to the mechanisms of power, even as those mechanisms themselves were changing. Meanwhile, the dining room also began to host contemporary interventions. In the 2010s, Waddesdon commissioned installations by artists like Edmond de Waal, the ceramicist and author whose work often explores themes of collecting, memory, and the fragility of cultural objects. De Waal created pieces that were placed among the porcelain and silver in various rooms, including the dining room. His installations, often simple arrangements of handmade porcelain vessels, provided a quiet visual counterpoint to the ornate Meissen service and the gilded opulence of the room. The effect was striking. De Waal's plain white vessels, elegant but understated, sat on the same table where George III's silver once gleamed. The contrast was not confrontational, but it was deliberate. It asked visitors to think about what collecting means, about the relationship between old objects and new ones, about the ways in which memory is constructed and displayed. The dining room, in these moments, became not just a historical exhibit, but a space for reflection on the present's relationship to the past. Room guides, updated regularly to incorporate new scholarship, now explicitly address the dining room's political and financial context. Visitors were told that weekend parties at Waddesdon once entertained kings, queens, and prime ministers, and that invitations to these parties were understood in certain circles as markers of rising status. The critic's line from the Jewish Chronicle, that an invitation to Waddesdon meant the invited is a rising member of his profession or is coming to the front in diplomacy or politics, was quoted in the exhibition text, providing a contemporary voice that confirmed what the architecture itself suggested. The interpretive approach also began to ask questions rather than simply providing answers. Labels in the dining room posed queries: who paid for the plates, who sat at the Hippolyte table, and who never did? What labor sustained the dinners? What political decisions were rehearsed here, and what were their consequences? These questions, though gentle in tone, encouraged visitors to think critically about the house and what it represented, not as a simple celebration of beauty, but as a complex document of an era when wealth, power, and culture intersected in ways that were both creative and troubling. The narrator suggests that Waddesdon has become a place where the history of wealth is itself curated and questioned. This shift reflects broader changes in how museums and historic houses present their collections. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, institutions increasingly recognized that they had a responsibility not just to preserve and display objects, but to contextualize them, to explain where wealth came from, whose labor sustained it, and what consequences it had. Waddesdon, under Jacob Rothschild's leadership, and with the support of the National Trust, embraced this responsibility. The dining table in this new framework was shown with a modern artwork at its center, a quiet, visual clash between 19th century excess and contemporary minimalist reflection. The artwork, whether by de Waal or another commissioned artist, did not diminish the room's historical grandeur, but it complicated it. It reminded visitors that the room was not just a window into the past, but a space where present concerns about memory, about justice, about the legacies of empire and finance could be explored. The Balfour Declaration exhibition, in particular, marked a turning point. By displaying documents that connected the Rothschilds to the creation of Israel, Waddesdon acknowledged that the family's history could not be separated from larger political narratives that were, in many cases, still unresolved. The exhibition did not take a position on current Middle Eastern politics, but it recognized that the documents it displayed continued to matter, that the past was not simply past but remained active in the present. In a house built to normalize power, the labels now asked who paid for the plates, and who sat at the table, and who never did. These questions, posed without didacticism but with genuine curiosity, invited visitors to see Waddesdon not as a monument to be admired uncritically, but as a historical site to be engaged with thoughtfully. The dining room, in this context, became a space where admiration and critique could coexist, where the beauty of the Beauvais tapestries and the elegance of the Meissen service could be appreciated, while also acknowledging the systems of power and labor that had made their assembly possible. The house had become a place where history was not only preserved but interrogated, where the past was kept alive not to be revered, but to be understood. We return, finally, to the state dining room as it exists today. The table is laid, as it has been since 1959, in a permanent arrangement based on Ferdinand's photographs from the 1890s. The Meissen service runs the length of the polished wood, flanked by George III's silver and silk flowers that stand in for the roses that once scented the air. The Beauvais tapestries hang on either side of the overmantel, their shepherds and nymphs still frozen in pastoral reverie. The chandelier, its crystals recently cleaned, catches the controlled light and throws it back in 100 fractured points. Visitors move quietly around the rope barrier, guided by audio tours that explain the room's history, its furnishings, and its function. Room stewards, trained by the National Trust and the Rothschild Foundation, answer questions and ensure that no one touches the furniture or crosses the barrier. Outside, the parterres and avenues are immaculate, maintained by a team of gardeners who work year-round to preserve Élie Lainé's original design. The house is kept within precise environmental limits. Temperature and humidity are monitored constantly, adjusted to protect the textiles and furniture from the slow violence of decay. Interpretive materials, updated regularly to incorporate new scholarship, emphasize that Waddesdon is one of the National Trust's most visited properties. Hundreds of thousands of visitors come each year. Far more people than ever dined in the room during Ferdinand's lifetime. Each footstep, though individually insignificant, registers faintly in conservation records. Each visitor raises the humidity in the room slightly through their breath and body heat. Each flash photograph, now discouraged, though not forbidden, once risked the fading of tapestries, though modern lighting protocols and conservation techniques have mitigated that risk. The dining room, in its current state, occupies an ambiguous position. It is not a ruin in the physical sense. Its surfaces gleam, its furnishings are intact, its aesthetic integrity is carefully maintained, but as a social space, it is fundamentally ruined. Its original function, to host a small, powerful elite, to facilitate conversations that shaped policy, to convert wealth into influence, has ended. What remains is a beautifully maintained shell of that function, filled now with the wider public and their questions. The historian reflects on how the dining room has moved through three distinct phases. First, it was an instrument of influence, a place where politics, finance, and social ambition intersected. The dinners held here in the 1880s and 1890s were not merely social occasions. They were tactical gatherings where alliances were tested, policies debated, and votes informally counted before they were formally cast in Parliament. The room's design, its acoustics, its lighting, its carefully calibrated grandeur, served this function directly. Second, it became a family relic, cherished but increasingly unsustainable as a private way of life. Under Alice, and later under James and Dorothy, the dining room continued to be used, but on a reduced scale and with a different purpose. It was no longer a political salon, but a family space, a place where the Rothschilds gathered for holidays and anniversaries, a container for heirlooms that connected them to their own history. The room, during this phase, began its transformation from active space to memorial. Third, it has become a public monument, preserved as evidence of an era when architecture was used to transcend mortality. Visitors who stand in the dining room today are not seeing a living space, but a historical exhibit. They are not witnessing influence being exercised, but learning about how influence was once exercised. The room has been translated from the language of use into the language of memory, and that translation, however carefully done, changes its meaning. The closing shot mirrors the opening. The chandelier reflected in polished wood, the light refracting through crystal, the table set as if for a dinner that will begin at any moment. But this time, the reflections include the blurred shapes of modern visitors, families with children, elderly couples, solo travelers consulting guidebooks, school groups being lectured by teachers. The reflections also include the faint glow of exit signs, mounted discreetly but visibly, reminding everyone that this is a public space with fire codes and safety regulations, not a private residence where guests can linger indefinitely. Baron Ferdinand built this room to outlast him. It did. But what survived was not his power, only the trace of it, light on porcelain, footsteps on marble, and a table that remembers conversations no one can now quite hear. The survival is real, but it is also incomplete. The physical fabric of the room, the tapestries, the marble, the silver, has been preserved through continuous intervention, through the labor of conservators and the investment of the National Trust and the Rothschild Foundation. But the social world that gave the room meaning has vanished entirely. What remains then is not the past itself, but a representation of the past, carefully constructed and maintained for educational purposes. The dining room functions now as a three-dimensional historical document, offering visitors a glimpse of how a certain class of people lived at a certain moment in time. It teaches about the Gilded Age, about the country house, about the Rothschild family's role in British society. But it cannot resurrect the experiences that once occurred here. It cannot bring back the voices of the diners, the texture of the conversations, the complex mix of ambition, anxiety, pleasure, and performance that defined a weekend at Waddesdon. The room is not a ruin in the physical sense. Its surfaces gleam. Yet, as a social space, it is fundamentally ruined. Its original function has ended. This paradox defines Waddesdon's current state. The house is simultaneously perfectly preserved and irrevocably lost. It survives as architecture, as art, as an assemblage of valuable objects. But it does not survive as what it was, a living instrument of power and hospitality. Outside, the gardens continue to bloom on schedule, their parterres and fountains maintained according to Laennet's original plans. Inside, the dining room waits under its chandelier, laid for a feast that ended more than a century ago. The table remembers in its polished surface the reflections of faces that are now recorded only in photographs and genealogies. The room endures, but what it endures as, a monument, a museum exhibit, a site of memory, is something Ferdinand could not have imagined when he stood on Lodge Hill in 1874 and began to plan a château. Architecture keeps faith with no one. It remembers everyone equally, host, guest, servant, visitor, as passing figures beneath a ceiling that, for a little while longer, still holds.